understand the root of this conflict, we must first journey to Paris, France, in the year 1919. Months after the World War I armistice was signed, delegates from all around the world arrived at the Paris Peace Conference, where victorious countries met up to draw up suitable punishment for the defeated nations. Some participants hoped for revenge and reparations, while others hoped for lasting peace, so that World War would never plague the continents again. Both Russia and Germany were notably absent from these conferences. In the summer of 1919, the Germans were at last invited to Versailles, France, where the delegates were forced to sign a peace treaty. The conditions of the treaty forced Germany to hand over large portions of land to the Allies. They were forbidden from maintaining their naval and air forces, and the army was to be reduced to a mere 100,000 men. The Allies also swamped the Germans with millions of dollars in debt. But what angered the Germans the most was Article 231 of the treaty, in which they were forced to accept all guilt and blame for the war.
Years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the German economy fell into a crisis. Massive inflation meant that the German mark had hardly any value. A man by the name of Adolf Hitler arrived on the political scene with his Nazi party. He used the feelings of disappointment and despair among the German people to his advantage, and instilled in them a strong sense of national pride. His popular doctrine propelled him into a position of total power. Hitler refused to obey the limitations put in place by the Treaty of Versailles and began to build a massive army. In an attempt to avoid another world war, the English Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, decided to appease Hitler and allowed him to expand.
In an effort to avoid a two-front war, Hitler strategically coerced Joseph Stalin, leader of former German war enemy Russia, to sign a mutual non-aggression pact. The contract proved to be flimsy, as Hitler's troops invaded Russia soon after. Hitler then commenced his campaigns of conquest, first heading north to Denmark and Norway. Denmark went down in 4 hours, and Norway in a mere 2 months. These newly annexed territories gave him perfect ports and airstrips from which he could launch attacks on Britain.
Following the invasions of Denmark and Norway, the Germans proceeded to France, engaging in a 6-week-long struggle for power. A German victory enabled the establishment of 4-year puppet government in Vichy. In late May, thousands of French and Belgian soldiers found themselves stranded on the shoreline of France. In a miraculous rescue effort that utilized hundreds of civilian ships, the British Navy carried the 338,000 stranded soldiers to safety out of the French port Dunkirk to camps in England.
In 1940, Winston Churchill stepped in as the new Prime Minister of England. He did away with the old appeasement policy of his predecessor and encouraged his people to stay strong throughout the vicious air raids by the Germans and strike when they became weak.
Lift up your heart. All will come right. Out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice will be born again the glory of mankind.
After overtaking France, Hitler planned to attack Great Britain and obliterate its Royal Air Force. Thus, in the summer of 1940, Hitler sent the German Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, to bomb the island. Pilots were instructed to destroy any aircraft factories and airfields that they could find, depleting the resources of the British. As fall rolled around the corner, Hitler decided to strike larger cities, hoping to instill fear among the British victims. However, the Royal Air Force was able to combat the attacks of the Germans using radar and an Enigma machine to decode secret messages. When the German planes arrived, the English were waiting for them. The Germans altered their strategy and began only sending attacks at night. Starting in October and lasting until May, the Germans bombed England nearly every night, and the raids became known as the Battle of Britain. Eventually, Hitler pulled his air force out of England, proving to the rest of the world that the Nazis were not invincible. After decades of dispute over the Pacific, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese dropped a great deal of bombs and missiles in order to destroy the U.S. naval fleet. More than 2,300 Americans were killed, with over 1,100 wounded. next day, American President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan and its allies. After Hitler's success in France, Mussolini, the totalitarian leader of Italy, realized he had to take action in order to please his ally. Mussolini declared war on Great Britain and France and then proceeded to Egypt, forcing British troops backward. The British put up a valiant fight, leaving the Germans with few soldiers to fight back. Hitler sent the Afrika Korps, led by the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel, to rescue and revive the Germans, and thus the Corps pushed the British into Libya and eventually captured Tobruk.
In September of 1942, German General Friedrich Paulus marched his troops into the Russian city of Stalingrad. The Russians followed their scorched earth policy, burning their land before retreating. The Germans were advancing, but the burnt landscape cut them further and further from their supply lines. In November, the Soviets trapped almost 300,000 German soldiers into the city. Unequipped for a frigid winter, Hitler finally surrendered, a joyous win for the Russians as Germany was defeated.
Seeking vengeance after Pearl Harbor, a string of B-25 bombers led by American Colonel James Doolittle performed a series of raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The destruction from the attacks was minimal, but it boosted the morale of the American people. On June 6, 1944, British, French, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in hopes of liberating France from Germany. This military operation, called D-Day, was the largest land and sea attack the world had ever seen. After months of battle, the Allies had freed Luxembourg, France, and Belgium. The Axis powers were close to surrender.
After suffering major losses, Hitler's troops entered the Battle of Berlin in a desperate attempt to gain back national pride. After 5 months of fighting, the Allies won over the Germans on May 7, and this day became forever known in history as Victory over Europe Day. In May of 1942, the Americans and Japanese met on the high seas, engaging in a completely new form of naval battle. Neither ship fired a single shot, but instead sent airplanes to attack enemy ships. The Allies had at last halted the Japanese southward advance. This battle, notorious for its use of aircraft carriers, became known as the Battle of the Coral Sea.
As word that the Japanese were constructing an airbase on the island of Guadalcanal reached the Americans, General Douglas MacArthur decided to take action immediately. Several thousand U.S. Marines stormed the island, but were met with equal amounts of Japanese soldiers. The battle lasted 6 months and resulted in a victory for the Allies. However, casualties on both sides were immense.
The United States held one of their key airfields on the island named Midway in the Pacific Ocean off of Hawaii. Hoping to destroy this airfield and gain a vital victory over the United States, the Japanese planned an attack. However, the United States caught word of the attack and were ready for the Japanese invasion. Caught off guard, many Japanese aircraft carriers were successfully destroyed.
In autumn of 1944, the Americans began to advance on Japan and its surrounding territories. As spring approached, the Allies overtook Iwo Jima and then occupied Okinawa. On June 21st, one of the most brutal battles of the war had ended, with a victory for the Allied powers.
Refusing to surrender, the United States decided to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb, named Fat Man, was dropped over Hiroshima. 3 days later, the United States dropped Little Boy, the second bomb, over Nagasaki. A devastating total of 140,000 people were killed by these 2 bombs combined.
On September 2nd, the Japanese surrendered and World War II came to an end.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.